Well, I guess as we get started, this is the talk for SyScan2013, but I thought I would record it here as sort of a post-conference discussion. It has very minor edits. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dave Atel. I'm the CEO of Immunity, which is a boutique security firm. And the talk is on cyber war, and it's everything Buffy the Vampire Slayer taught me about cyber war, which frankly is quite a lot. In some senses, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a growing of age story that sort of coincided with the time when I was sort of learning all this security stuff, which was about 10 years ago. So it's a good hook, and we sort of go into a lot of different things. Hopefully you will not be completely bored, because we do have a cast of exciting characters to bring along with us. For those of you who do not know all of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer characters, I'll try to introduce you a little bit. And one of the things that I think is great about Buffy the Vampire Slayer is some of the characters are pretty blunt. We're going to try to be pretty blunt in this talk if we can. And we kind of want to start out, I think, historically. Any keynote, and this is a keynote particularly towards like-minded folks, but any keynote tends to be a discussion of your past and your history and how you came to a unique perspective, ideally. And this is no doubt about that. And I think one of the things about this industry and this sort of community, the information security community, is that it's weirder the more you dig into it, right? Like one of my friends once said, there's no way a movie could portray accurately the hacker community, because the hacker community is too weird to believe. And over the past 10 years, has become only one hacker community. I think it's very interesting to me that there's three major groups or sort of fonts of hackers: the government sort of military-industrial complex font of hackers, the industry, mostly defensive, pen testing industry font of hackers, and of course what we would call the sort of criminal underground font of hackers. And all of these three groups have essentially joined and now travel as one larger pack. And your distance between yourself and anybody in the community is going to be less than 1 or 2. So I guess less than 1 would imply it was you. But that's, I think, one of the things about this. And in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of course, the Buffy character spends quite a lot of time defending her hometown. And it's sort of a secret identity that she is the Vampire Slayer. But deep down, everybody in her hometown knows what she does at night. It's sort of part of the funny bits of the show. And so for me in particular, I used to work with the National Security Agency, and then I left in about 2000 to join At Stake, and this is what a information security boutique startup looked like back then. You take money, you build a bunch of offices, you do pure play security consulting. But they also had a very small research team that did work. I was not on that research team. In fact, I kind of hate the term research when it's applied to what it is information security people do. Because what they kind of do, as research, I would sort of just call work, right? Like you're trying to learn stuff. And I think it's weird that if you learn stuff for yourself, it's research. And if you learn stuff on behalf of a company, it's consulting. It's just a bizarre sort of thing that our industry does with words. But nonetheless, back in the day, I was writing little tools like this. This is something called DCE test. I believe you can still get it in certain places, Packet Storm or something like that. And back in the day, it was a useful tool, right? This was 2001. I also wrote one of the early fuzzers, Spike, which more people honestly have used. But they were both written for the same purpose, which was that there was sort of a path that you followed as a early hacker to essentially find vulnerabilities and do the stuff you do, which was you find some awful, awful thing that nobody wanted to know. And in my case, this was MSRPC and sort of COM and DCOM and that sort of stuff. Almost the worse the technology is, the better, right? Like mainframes, X400, X25. If it's something that even the language they use in the Wikipedia article is frightening or perhaps frighteningly boring, then it's perfect. And so all you do is you enumerate all the endpoints with whatever stupid tool you can craft together. You can call it DCE test if you like, which stands for DCE RPC. And then you race to find all the vulnerabilities in those endpoints before anyone else catches on that this is a worthwhile behavior. And that's how you won at hacking in early 2000s. It may actually be how you win at hacking these days as well. You just have to pick even more horrible monsters to attempt to attack. And as a hacker, many of the people at SyScan or Infiltrate or any of the other decent conferences, they're full of these people who have gone through this path and eventually are good enough to own virtually anything because they do MSRPC, then they do, DC RPC, Sun RPC. You pick like 100 of these things, and then eventually you've got enough in your arrows in your quiver to own anything. And for a lot of these people, the ability to own things is addictive. And it's funny because people look at cyber criminals as financial criminals in a way, but realistically I think they have a lot more to deal with as addicts, right? It's an addictive behavior, and the people who get involved in this kind of thing, the only way to really succeed is to become addicted. So it becomes an issue of self-control and managing your addiction more than anything else. And so I just find that a fascinating part. It's like, for example, Alberto Gonzalez gets caught by the FBI, becomes an informant, and then decides to go back into criminal hacking. And I find that, that's true across the board. This happens, you probably see this in a bunch of different cases, and it's because it's addictive. It's not something that you get over. So, for those of you who do manage to have some self-control, breaking the internet becomes this rite of passage. And yes, I do know that we spelled right correctly here, but I'm not the graphic artist who can fix it. So, I guess the funniest thing for me was there was a hacker, Dan Kaminsky. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he found a DNS vulnerability that allowed you to spoof domain names, which is a pretty useful thing to do in the category of things that can break internet bits. And the funniest thing was how big a splash he was able to make out of it, because almost every hacker I know has found, 10 or 15 of these kinds of vulnerabilities. And that's what they, every year they'll find another few of these things and play with them, and that's just how it is. It's easy for the outside community to see any one of these things as, oh my gosh, let's report on it in the media, and what are we going to do about this kind of event? When in fact these events are definitely not the black sheep. They're really, this is sort of an everyday thing, finding these sorts of vulnerabilities. And then the question is, what do you do with that, right? Like, once you have become the kind of person who can find these vulnerabilities and who is essentially addicted to finding these vulnerabilities, then all of a sudden you get a sort of outside world influence on you, right? Like, this is, you start noticing that this is not something you do in a vacuum in your little house. Unless, I guess, you're a Russian mathematician of some kind. And that's where cyber war comes into it, right? Because the breaking of these cyber rules and then using them to do things is something that governments and militaries and criminal organizations have all sort of really delved into in the past 5 years. And there's actually a great scene in Buffy where they start talking about this, because one of the characters in Buffy ends up sort of going into the machines, the way sort of a ghost in the machine kind of aspect to it. And then Buffy's little character group has to figure out what it is they want to do about it. And they're like, well, why would we do anything about it? What is it he can do? And one of those things, obviously, is medical attacks. And there's been a few talks recently at various conferences about attacking pacemakers and MRI machines and who knows what else is attached to the internet. And, of course, one of the other ones is randomizing traffic signals. And if you've lived through a city like Miami without traffic signals, you know that it is, in fact, a very bad thing when traffic signals become unreliable or disabled. Very bad meaning it was extremely painful. And of course, Buffy in this case goes back to the nuclear missile and nuclear weapons. What if someone was able to gain control of those? And it doesn't have to be America's nuclear weapons. It realistically could be Russia's or any other countries, because if any nuclear weapon anywhere in the world goes off, you can bet the United States has to become involved. And then, of course, the economic impact of cyber war is really something that people are very much starting to focus on. You saw a little bit of this in the presidential debates of our last presidential cycle. But, certainly when you have reports coming out almost daily about new companies, today was Kinetic's day in the sun, right? This company has had its reputation dragged through the mud for the past 18 hours because they are apparently owned by the Chinese left, right, and center, as every other Fortune 100 is. And then they come back in the end to nuclear weapons, and I think it's almost that is a very early 2000s way of thinking about the damage cyber war can do. We're going to try to discuss a little bit around that. And just, there's a surprisingly large number of websites where you will find nuclear weapon simulators where you can sort of pick any sort of not common, but standard nuclear weapon and then put it wherever you want and see where the blast radius would be. And you can see here that if they decide to take out Alapata with a standard Russian SS-25 ICBM, that in fact my house here in Miami Beach will be perfectly okay. And then if you look here, the talk was in Singapore. I decided to give them a little, decide where they could go. Obviously, these are nightmare scenarios, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting to see how, they're in some sense commoditized nightmares. The day I was giving the talk in Singapore, the article came out in Bloomberg where the Chinese have decided that, wait a minute, this in fact can be equivalent to a nuclear bomb. And I totally agree with them. I think not only equivalent, but in fact more scary. And I don't mean to be flippant about nuclear bombs. It's just that there are things you can do with cyber that, even if they do not cause the immediate massive damage that a nuclear weapon would cause, they can cause sustained, ongoing, targeted damage, which is a much more scary thing if you really think about it. So for those of you who have U.S. Security clearances or perhaps other security clearances, the next couple slides have WikiLeaks pastes in them, so if you could close your eyes. The first one I want to paste is something from the Russians, a meeting between the Russians and the United States, where Russia's ambassador said that an arms race in cyberspace was at hand, and that it was the United States who first recognized that cyber capabilities could be more destructive than weapons of mass destruction. I think that it's interesting to see that the sort of Russians and the Chinese sort of come to grips with what they would consider a evolving military political strategy. And then, of course, the Americans, at the time, cybersecurity was high on the Obama administration's agenda. I don't think that's changed in any way. I think it's still quite high. And the United States has a very interesting point where they say, we don't necessarily think that a traditional arms control type of constraint will be effective, considering that governments have no particular monopoly on attack tools, and attacks could be carried out by proxies. So it's just a very interesting perspective dating back to the WikiLeaks leaks. Okay, and you can open your eyes again if you are sensitive to such things. This is an InfoSucks comic. If you haven't read them, they're all good. But in this particular case, the remote buffer overflows on an internet-wide scale in 1988. And of course, I think the fact that people have been doing this for a long time, and doing it at a high skill level, in this case, that's, I think we're assuming that Robert Morris Jr. got a lot of his skills from his dad. That may or may not be the case. The you know, this is kind of where people's, after you sort of enter the information security club, people's heads start to have to evolve, and you're like, well, there's a lot of people out there who can do this work and can do it at a very high level. And when it sort of started coming out that the Chinese were owning the entire Fortune 100, this really came out with Aurora. I think Google came out publicly and said, hey, we have a problem here. We're going to pull out of China and essentially become, a non-nation state enemy of China, which is a fairly sophisticated thought process to go through if you think about it. But it is not, in my opinion, possible for any entity to clean their internet from the Chinese attackers at this point, right? Like the Kinetic article this morning talked about how the Chinese were in almost all parts of Kinetic, and they were bouncing through Kinetic to other companies. And at this point, it's safe to assume that if you have computers, then there's going to be a Chinese influence on those computers, pulling data off them, which I think is very valid. Like, I think if that's your assumption, you're probably completely right. Of course, I'm doing this on a computer, but nonetheless, that's one of my sort of main theses of this talk, and I try to examine that a little bit in terms of what does it take to actually do that. And it is sort of more than a single hacker can do, because it's a big job. I think that's fair enough, but I don't think it's necessarily more than a medium-sized company can do. And in this case, I represent that with the little Scooby gang here, but a medium-sized company has fairly good resources. And the reason I think they can do it is that you sort of look at what it would take from a technology perspective, and you sort of do, different Trojans per year, different kernel locals per year, all these sort of inside baseball terms for what it is hackers actually use to do their job. And you look at that and you say, one interesting thing we're noticing is that individual vulnerabilities are really never found. It's sort of a rare thing for ODE to be killed, as we would say. Maybe 12 a year of really good client-side vulnerabilities get found. You get maybe 2 or 3 rootkits a year get found. A couple remotes. Realistically, the number of vulnerabilities discovered by security teams is really low in comparison to the number that we know must exist and are used in the wild. And in terms of rootkits, there's dozens of writable chips in your computer. The hard drive is really just another writable chip, right? And so when you guys try to clean off a computer by erasing just the hard drive, what about the other chips in the computer? Usually nothing is, I guess, the answer. But probably the prudent thing to do would be to throw it all out. And I also thought it was interesting that really no one measures Microsoft in word processors per year, which is the kind of measurement that you apply to a hacking company. It's like, it's great that you produced a local vulnerability, but now I need 10 more of those. So what's your rate per year? So what you do is, when you talk to people about this stuff, and I talked to some fairly decent hackers when I was sort of going through this talk, trying to ask them questions about, is it possible to do this work? And I'm happy to hear from other people with perspectives, of course, which is why we're making this talk public. But you get people who say, what if we just clean off all the networks and we build a strong perimeter and we do internal monitoring and we have the NSA, and Keith Alexander is a big proponent of this, and he's like, we're going to do external monitoring on the perimeter and sort of all of the external internet if we can, and on the inside we're going to lock everything down and we're going to kick these people out. And I'm like, well, there's 3 possibilities when you go to the Fortune 100 and you do that. You say, here's what we're going to do. And the first possibility is that the Chinese or the Russians or whoever's in there leaves and then just comes back in later with their many millions of passwords that they have and their complete knowledge of your network and all the amazing things that they know. And the second thing that they could do is, as they see you kicking them out, they just set a little time bomb in there, and if they're not able to connect to their Trojans, the Trojans start doing as much damage as possible. Number 2 here is unlikely in the sense that that's the Saudi Aramco situation, right? And the United States Defense Department has said, if we see people doing that, we're going to bomb people. That's pretty much our response. Now, we've said many things, and we're currently saying hilarious things in Syria, so no one's sure what to believe yet because this has never been tested. But the reality is that that's such an offensive action that you know there will be a reaction. But the third possibility is the WikiLeaks possibility. And if you've listened to my previous talk on what a cyber weapon is, you'll know that one of the things that I view as one of the more potent offensive cyber weapons is just leaking things. It can be done extremely painfully. If you look at what happened to H.B. Gary, or H.B. Gary was in the Kinetic article this morning. That's how far the ramifications of a leak can go. It's really never a good thing for you, the company. And so if you go down the list, I think ExxonMobil's at the top. So you clean off ExxonMobil, and then you start going down. I actually don't know what the Fortune 100 is right now, but let's say you go down to the next one, and the Chinese say, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to start leaking some of their internal documents. So they leak, say, the CEO's mailbox of whatever that company is. And so you go through and you clean that stuff up. But this, at this point, the next company in line is like, we don't want our CEO's mailbox to get leaked. There's a lot of very, very sensitive things in there. But they do it anyway, and so the CEO's mailbox gets leaked, and then all the top executives' mailbox gets leaked, and then maybe all their internal documents get leaked. And I guarantee you the fourth person in line is saying, leave us alone, right? Because they can't afford the kind of damage that these leaks will cause. So that's really, the most likely possibility against strong pressure defense is going to be leaking of all this stuff, and therefore providing a political incentive for companies to let the parasites stay where they are. Because they don't know how bad they're getting hurt by data coming to the Chinese, but they know exactly how bad they'll get hurt if the data goes to everybody. And that sort of leads you to believe that, it's not just the Chinese that have this ability, right? Like, does the global security of our new commons, which is the internet, depend on how fast the system can contain medium-sized companies? Because that's a scary thought, and I think it might be true. And I think it's, sort of as a corollary, also true that kicking China out is going to be essentially as hard as denuclearizing them. You're going to have to negotiate. It's not something you can really swoop in with a team of Navy SEALs to sort of neutralize the bombs. There's just too many of them. It's just the defenses are too big to sort of try to rip this kind of power out of someone's hands. And one of the reasons I think that these things have such power is that they are so resilient, right? And the whole previous few slides was about how resilient exactly I think they are. But there's another side of the resilience, which is that things don't change that much on the internet. If you ever find a new vulnerability, you can pretty much guarantee that even if a patch comes out for that vulnerability, it will still be useful in 10 years. Because people don't change their systems that often. The internet is actually really slow to change. And not just the internet, but all the intranets, right? All those little places where, once you're past the firewall, there's like a huge intranet inside. Those things never change. There's lots of stories about people installing, factories or, iron smelters where they just can't be turned off. They simply cannot be turned off. So they don't often get patched and rebooted and that sort of thing. And again, flexibility. One thing when I was making this talk and I started talking it around to people, they're like, well, cyber just doesn't scare me the way a nuclear bomb does. And on one hand, that's a good thing, because that means no one's really pulled the trigger on cyber yet. But on the other hand, it sort of shows a lack of foreknowledge, right? Because cyber has the ability to do lots of damaging things, and if you start pontificating about all the ways these things could be damaging, you come off like a complete douchebag. And I'd prefer not to do that in this talk, but let's just say they are really scary, and all you have to do is sit around with a good hacker for 10 minutes and give them a budget and say, we want you to do something really awful, horrible, make it abominable to pick a country, and hear the awful things that come out of his mouth. And there will be many. And that sort of speaks to the impact as well. Some of the Brits have a sort of saying where, like, pick any modern city and 3 missed meals, and then there's riots in the streets. And I think if you looked at what happened when they locked down Boston, if you're not going to carry milk to people's babies, then the people are going to go out and get milk for their babies. That's what's going to happen. And that's true in any civilized area. You don't have that long until things get really bad in a modern city. And you don't have to have a nuclear bomb to make things bad. I guess an important thing. So because of these factors, I believe that cyber offensive technologies are going to be used to replace and extend traditional deterrence. People think of nuclear deterrence as the only deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is a clear aspect of deterrence, but I think cyber offensive technologies in particular have a much better chance of deterring some of your larger players, partially because they can be used and sort of in a graduated way. Yet all of those ways will be pretty painful for whoever's on the targeted end. One of those things is that, if you look at nuclear deterrence, you're looking at the standard triad. One of those things in the triad is the Ohio-class submarines. They're named after the first submarine of that class, which is the Ohio. Not to be tautology here. But those things they're awesome, right? They're huge. They're extremely powerful. They can carry out all sorts of exciting missions underwater, most of which involve hiding, some of which involve moving very slowly and then hiding. Hopefully their actual mission never actually gets called into play. But the Navy had a cool program for these. They called it 2 for 4. And what they meant was they'd love to float 2 more of these things for $4 billion. And for everybody in the audiences of Infiltrate or SyScan, when you say 2 for 4, they're thinking, $2 billion will buy you a lot of exploits. It'll buy you a lot of cyber warfare in general. It'll buy you a capability that might be able to replace an Ohio-class submarine, and possibly more than one Ohio-class submarine, as we currently have a few of them floating around in different oceans, subject to various nuclear treaties and things like that. The thing about that is that I don't necessarily know that we need the Ohio-class submarine. They're all about to get sort of end-of-lifed. Obviously, we're going to keep some, but we're going to be eventually, whether we want to or not, building a cyber force that is as big as our Navy. And that, it looks like that's kind of where we're going. We're doing it very slowly, but there's really no option away from that. The commons of the world used to be the oceans. That's how you did your commerce. Currently, it is our cyber world. If we want, T-shirts, we do still have to get them over an ocean of some kind sometimes. But deep down, every other piece of it is coming over the internet, and commons is also how you communicate, and that's a really important part of what it is. And realistically, what we're doing is we're replacing part of our Navy. I think it's also important that you really can't build a major weapon system these days without building a major cyber component to defend it. And at that point, you may not need the weapon system because the cyber system may be able to supplant it as well as defend it. I think that's definitely what you're seeing with modern Navy and Air Force machinery. So, we've had 1 to 2 generations that have been sort of free of this widespread fear of weapons of mass destruction. I don't necessarily know if that's going to continue, because I think it is probably likely that someone someday soon pulls the trigger on cyber, and we all have to live in that fear again. But you do kind of, whenever you're talking about offense, it's sort of, you can't not talk about defense and where that's going as well. And recently I attended the RSA conference in California again, because I attended it the year before as well. But this is the inside. It's a blurry cell phone picture of the inside of Symantec's Scientology-like brainwashing booth. And it's awesome. There's like a fake news play thing going on. You can see everyone looking a little confused, kind of like, what happens next? What happens next is you come out of this little building into a sales room where they try to sell you stuff, theoretically. Beautiful stuff. Here's all 20,000 people at RSA at 8:30 in the morning listening to a rendition of "We Are the Champions," which they are not. Let's just put it that way. And the reason they are not is because everything on the RSA floor. RSA is a very depressing place for people who want to make stuff that works, because everything on the RSA floor is the same thing. It is all security through obscurity, and that's. It took me a while to realize that. invariably, if you buy, and I pick on FireEye here, but you can pick on anybody at RSA, anyone with a booth. If you look at it and you say, okay, you have this random technology. In FireEye's case, they have like a virtualization hypervisory thing, and then you send your emails in, and then it checks to see if it exploited it, and if it does, hey, we found something, and it works right now, right? Each one of them is $150,000, and so if you wanted to make it work better, all you have to do is raise the price, because the only thing keeping it working is the fact that hackers haven't bothered to buy one yet, or they're trying to go through their budgetary harm because they have bureaucracy just like everyone else, and they're like, hey, we need one of these things so that we can make our stuff work around it, but they're $150,000, so let's get 5 of them, right? So that's what keeps these things working. The minute any of them gets one of these, all of them stop working, and that's true for everything in the RSA floor. Antivirus, like obviously Symantec and McAfee and Kaspersky and all those have the biggest booths, and they have the exact, because they're the prime example of security through obscurity. This is how it works. No one here will ever let attackers get a piece of their hardware, because they know the instant anyone does that, game's over. And I think it's quite funny if you've ever tried to, hey, why don't you guys send me a trial? They'll never do that. This is what it looks like when you fail. That's me failing at life, and in this case failing at being able to stand up. At the last Infiltrate, we do jiu-jitsu at Infiltrate, as everyone should. And of course, I think the reasons deep down for why all of the defensive technologies for the past 10 years have completely failed is that a lot of them are built in the VC deal way, right? You sort of, a big company can have a time span like an insect. They sort of think about, what's happening in the next quarter. VC companies essentially want to get their money back in about 5 years. And they'd like to get, obviously, 10 times their money back, but they're happy to fail as well, right? They just want to win on sort of some of things. So even though they always sort of burst onto the scene and you're like, wow, what an amazing technology, because their marketing and sales and everything is sort of going strong, it comes down to success theater, because they don't have to worry about what happens in 10 years. They don't have to worry about what happens in 8 years, because in 5 years, they've either sold or they've failed. They're done. Whereas, with a lot of companies that are sort of the smaller, more offensive companies, we're 10 years old. I've been in this business for 10 years. Immunity, the company that I'm CEO of, is 10 years old. SyScan, the conference that this keynote originally was given in, is 10 years old now. A lot of these companies are investing in small ways in technology that will take another 10 years to pay off. And this is why governments tend to rule the roost here, because governments are happy to invest large sums of money for 20 years at a time for something that will pay off in 50 years. That's the amazing thing about this, is that if you're not doing that, if your quantum computing team is less than 50 people big, then you're definitely going to fail in 50 years. And that's just one of those things. But that doesn't mean we haven't had to go through quite some interesting times in the past 10 years. For example, XPSP2, where they locked down MSRPC, the implementations that hardened their heaps. For example, the modern Windows 8 heap is a tough thing to exploit, pretty different. ASLR for the randomization of the stack and the other addresses. DEP, sandboxes. The iPhone has an extremely hardened, trusted system. There's no code running on it that's not signed, for example. And of course, the thing that everyone's pointing to is the next one is sort of big data. But I think it's also important to look at what has not really, what people said would cause the sky to fall, but which definitely didn't have much of an impact. And IDS and IPS, and when I say that, and if you're in the government, you should be thinking Einstein and Einstein 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and all the rest of those systems that are built exactly the same as stuff we know that doesn't work. Static code analysis, everyone has been very scared about it. If it could handle loops, it might be scarier. Web scanners, some of these things clearly can find some vulnerabilities, but they can't really handle the kind of business logic vulnerabilities that tend to do some of the most damage. And then network security scanners, it's the rate of false positives on a lot of these things is just so high that the impact that they make is lower than you would expect. So, when we talk about big data, a lot of these times you want to think about, well, how are people going to do that in 5 years from now? And the reality is, right now they gather all the data they can, and then they try to sort through it, which sometimes is not the way to do things. The really dangerous thing to do is to gather only the data that you think you must absolutely have. And in our case, that's often just data from create process or similar things like that across your enterprise, and then correlate it across your enterprise, not globally across the whole world, as everyone seems to think you want to do, right? I mean, the reason Symantec, McAfee, Kaspersky, and the rest of them are sending all of your data back to themselves is because they think they can provide more value that way, but they also don't want you free to do your own analysis. Realistically, you need to be in control as an enterprise of your own data, and that's going to be a big change for a lot of these companies. So yeah, I think realistically the people that succeed in cyber war, especially over the long term, are those of us who know the plural of apocalypse, which, to be fair, I'm not good enough at English to know. And you have to sort of learn how to live through a series of this stuff. I definitely remember when people were coming back at us and saying, oh, XP Service Pack 2 is out. We're not really going to be able to hit overflows anymore, so let's try to move into something else. I guess like SQL injection. And I think as sort of a few final points, one of which is having a Navy changes a country, but having a cyber force is going to change them more. They're more tightly connected. Their value systems are not necessarily those that their governments think they are. I mean, one thing I like to tease the Israelis and Iranians with is, do they in fact believe in God? Because let's just say that religiousness is as common in hackers as a burger-eating fetish is in professional models. And I think it's very odd that a sort of religious theocracy, such as the Iranian government, thinks hackers are in fact going to be a useful part of their future arsenal. The same thing's a little bit true about the Chinese, if less so. But in general, it's true for all countries, right? The hackers, the giant military hacker industrial complex in America is going to change America too. And so there's lots of things that the hacker community really does need to work on. If those of you saw Halvar's interpreted language abuse stuff from 2 years ago at Infiltrate, no one ever pays attention to Halvar's talks. Frankly, I'm really glad about that. He's one of the few people strategically I've ever really felt scared of. So I'm kind of glad. Nobody should listen to it. Don't listen to that one either. Timing attacks, we're all pretty bad at them, and we're getting slightly better. So in fact, there are people working on this. I saw a paper come out a couple weeks ago about doing timing attacks against the kernel to try to find out whether a page was mapped or something like that. But you can determine all sorts of things from timing attacks. What the heap layout is, or where an object is in relation to another object. There's a bunch of great stuff in there. Steganography. All the research in steganography died when DRM went the way of the Pukeko. I guess not the Pukeko, but the Dodo. Pukekos are everywhere, if you're in New Zealand at least. This is the picture of the Lena. And it used to be that if you were on Usenet, every third image you saw on Usenet had steganography in it. And I just thought it was really funny that no one ever pointed that out. Certainly, a high percentage of images these days may or may not have steganography in them, but no one will ever know because people's ability to do this kind of analysis is essentially nil. Likewise, Trojans. I think it's funny that Stuxnet and Flame and Dooku and all them came out, and everyone was like, wow, those Trojans are amazing. They're like from another planet. And I'm thinking, that's what you should have built years ago, and if you didn't, you were probably doing something else. I hope you were doing something more important than building Trojans. But nonetheless, we're hardly looking at examples of the kind of technology that you should be, amazed at. I think it's kind of a shame that Trojan technology is still HTTP connectbacks. And so there's always questions you ask yourself, and this is the question that I ask myself, and hopefully people will email me and stuff in response to this and ask other questions or just open conversations. But one of the reasons, I ask people sort of why they are still here, right? If you're at a big conference like this, why is it you're here? Are you here just because you're having a good time? Are you here to make some cash? Because making cash is often a good time, but not always. Or are you here because, in fact, controlling computation is the same as controlling cogitation at some level? And I think there are a lot of hackers out there who look at it as a sort of, we need to control this kind of event. And if you ever need to get a hold of me, or if you hate this talk for some reason, because I actually enjoy it more when people hate these talks, then that's my phone number, where you can text me and stuff. I very rarely answer my phone, but if I do, then that's how you'll reach me. And Twitter handles, which I answer more often, and email address, which you can feel free to email me at. I recently got a Trojan EPUB of a good book. So if you're going to do that, at least make it a good book. That is my recommendation. Likewise, all the discussion of this talk and other talks of this nature and all sorts of offensive information security things are on Daily Dave, which is a poorly named mailing list that has existed for many, many, many years and has pretty much everyone in our industry on it. And if you're not on it, then I assume that you are, in fact, listening to this talk in jail or something like that. So that is that. Feel free to email us and love to hear from you. And now it is time to say bye.